Hey there, welcome to day 10 of 100 Days of Code. And today we're going to learn about functions with outputs. Previously, we've already seen the other two flavors of functions, a plain function and also functions with inputs. But in today's lessons, we're going to be using the skills that we've learned, and we're going to be extending our knowledge of functions to build a calculator app. I think at some point in every programmer's lives, they will have built a calculator app. So if that hasn't already happened to you, then today is your lucky day because that's exactly what we're going to be making. So it's a simple text-based calculator, and we can start off by writing a number and then picking one of the operations: plus, minus, multiply, or divide. So I'm going to divide this by 2. And then it shows us the full calculation: 5 divided by 2 equals 2.5. And now we can continue calculating with the answer from the previous step, or we can type n to start a new calculation. Let me type y, and maybe I'll do 2.5 plus 6. And now I get 8.5. By the end of the lessons today, you'll have understood how functions really work, how you can use them to reduce redundant code, and how you can provide inputs to functions as well as providing outputs. Once you're ready, head over to the next lesson and let's get started. To begin, the first thing I want to talk about is more on functions. So we've already seen a couple of things that we can do with functions. The first thing I showed you was how to create a very simple bog standard function using the def, the name, the empty parentheses, and then the colon. And then within the body of the function, you can do a bunch of things which will be carried out every single time you trigger or call the function, like this. And the first type of function basically just helps you reduce the amount of code you have to write when you have instructions that you want to execute repeatedly. Now, the next type of function we saw actually had something inside the parentheses. And this something is an input which can be passed over when we call the function. So in this case, 123 is the argument which gets passed in to this parameter called something, and then it gets used within the body of the function. The second type of function, the functions which allow for inputs, gives us the ability to modify the code in the function and to get it to do something different each time depending on what input was passed in. We're now on to the final sort of flavor of functions. And these are functions which allow you to have an output once the function is completed. We start off with a simple function, and in this case you'll notice that even though I could, I'm actually not giving it any inputs. The inputs and the outputs are completely separate from each other. So this is a normal function that you've seen many times now. And within the body of the function, I'm going to do some piece of calculation. Let's say I'm going to calculate what is 3 times 2, and then save it to a variable called result. Now, once that's done, I can use the output keyword, which is return, and then after that keyword, I can put whatever it is I want to be the output of this function. So in this case, the output is the result. And what that means is when I call this function later on and it runs, then it will go ahead and output this result, and it replaces this line of code where this function was called. Now, that result is held in the code where the function was called, and I could save it to another variable. Result, of course, equals 3 times 2, and that means this output now equals 6. So this is what the code might look like. Somewhere I would define my function which has an output, which you can tell by the return keyword. Now, at some other point in my code, I decide to call that function. And once that function executes, that return, or whatever is outputted, replaces the function call. And at the very end, it means this variable output will store whatever the output is. So in this case, output would be equal to 6. The way that I like to think about functions with outputs is almost kind of like a machine, right? If you had a machine where in goes some empty bottles, and after some processing or some inputs, out comes a bottle filled with milk. So in this case, this function has an input, the empty glass bottle. It has an output, the glass bottle filled with milk. And in the middle, there's some processes or some code that's being executed to create this change. This ties together all the things that we've learned about functions. So now head over to the day 10 starting Replit and go ahead and fork your own copy of it. Now, once you have your own copy of it, we're going to create some functions with outputs of our own. But let's start off by creating a new function, which I'm going to call format name. And the reason is because this function is going to take a first name and a last name, and it's going to change those inputs. Even if it was lowercase or if it was all caps, it's going to change it into title case. Something like this, where the first letter is capitalized in each word. To begin, I want you to create this function and then go ahead and add two inputs to it. One called fname, so first name, and another called lname, which is the last name. Pause the video and give that a go. Alright, so all we have to do to add inputs to our function is just to put the names of these parameters inside the parentheses. So now our function is able to take these parameters as inputs whenever this function gets called. The next step is we're going to convert these strings that gets passed in. So it could be something like this, all lowercase, it could be all capitalized, or it could be kind of random, right? Like some are capitalized, some are not, but we're going to make it all uniform. So all of these are going to end up like this. And to do this, we can search around in Google and you might come across a similar question in Stack Overflow. How do you convert a string to title case in Python? They have an example and it's trying to do exactly what we're trying to do. If we take a look at the answers, you can see that somebody is helpfully pointing to this title function. So you take a string and then you write .title, and then afterwards the string gets transformed and every word now starts off with a capital letter. And if you want to know more about how this title case works, then you can click on that link in title and then have a read through the Python documentation. Once you've read through that, go ahead and modify this fname and lname so that they end up being both in title case. Pause the video and give that a go. Alright, so we want to go ahead and take this fname and then write a dot and then write title to convert it to title case. Once we've done that, then we're going to do the same with the lname. And if we go ahead and actually print these out, and of course, in order for the function to actually execute, we'll have to call the function. So I'm going to put two inputs in here. One, which is going to be just Angela all in lowercase. And then the second one is going to be Angela all in uppercase. And now when I run this code, you'll see that the result is they both get converted to title case. In essence, this part of the code becomes whatever the previous value of fname is converted to title case. You might have spotted already that this title function actually has an output. It returns a version of the string where each word is title cased. Instead of simply just printing this, we can also capture it inside a variable. Let's create a new variable called formatted fname and also formatted lname. Now, what's happening here is we are transforming this input fname, turning it into title case, and then once this function executes, it has an output. and that output replaces this part of the code, and then it gets stored inside this variable. Now we can go ahead and print the final version of our function, which is going to use an f string to take the formatted f name and then add a space and then print out the formatted L name, like this. Now, if I start out with my first name, but all in strange sort of casing, and then my last name in all caps, let's go ahead and hit run and see what happens. You can see that my first name gets converted to title case, my last name gets converted to title case, and then that result is stored in formatted f name, and this result becomes stored in this L name, and then they get printed and formatted, like so. Now, instead of printing this result out, we could also return it as well. In the same way that this title function returns the output, replaces this part of the code, we can also do the same with our format name function. So let's delete the print function and go ahead and use return instead. Now this formatted string becomes the output. And as we mentioned before, what happens with functions with outputs is this output replaces the part of the code where the function was called. Now, if this is the string that we want to print, then all we have to do is just to save the output, which replaces this part of the code, inside a variable like this. And then all we have to do is just go ahead and print that formatted string. As you can see, when I run the code, the same thing happens. Now you can, and you might have, alternatively, just taken this function call and put it straight inside the print statement. That works exactly the same way. And we can visualize this using Thonny. If I go ahead and paste everything we have inside the editor and go ahead and run debug, then we can step into and see what are the steps that happen. So the first thing when this line 6 gets executed is it tries to call this function, format name. So it passes in these two inputs, and we're now within the function where we have access to these two inputs, f name and L name. Now the formatted f name becomes the title case version of the first name, and the same thing happens with the last name. So we now have a formatted f name and a formatted L name, and that is what's going to be returned as the output. Now, once that's completed, that output replaces whatever was in between the print statement, which is where we called this format name function, and this is what gets printed into the console. As I mentioned before, we've actually already been using functions that we didn't create that have all of these functionalities, right? For example, the len function takes an input and has an output. The input is going to be a string, my name again. I seem to be really obsessed with my own name. So now this line of code is going to run this built-in length function, calculating the number of letters inside this input that we've given it, and then it's going to return the result as an output, which we can now capture inside a variable. This is the input, this is the function, and once this is completed, the return, or whatever it is after the return statement, is going to replace this part of the code. Then that result or output then gets stored inside this variable. So this return keyword is really the most important thing in order to create a function that has an output, because everything that comes after it is going to replace where the function was called. In the next lesson, we'll take a quick look at the return keyword in more detail. Specifically, let's see what happens when we have more than one return statement in the same function. All right, for all of that and more, I'll see you there. In the last lesson, we looked at functions that return some sort of value. We created a function called format name that returned a string. In this lesson, let's see what happens when a function has more than one return statement. When the computer encounters a line that has the word return on it, then it knows that this line is the end of the function. If I add a line of code after the return keyword, notice what happens when I run this code. It doesn't ever get executed. And this is because the return tells the computer that this is the end of the function and you should now exit the function. You can actually have multiple return keywords within the same function, and you can even have an empty return keyword, so just the return keyword without anything afterwards. So for example, we could check whether if the f name is equal to an empty string or the L name is equal to an empty string. So in this case, it means that when we called format name, maybe we didn't give it any inputs. For example, let's say that instead of just calling the function as it is, we actually used the inputs function. So what is your first name and what is your last name? Now what happens is it'll ask us for a input, and it will take these two inputs and then call that function and return the formatted version to be printed. So now in this case, it's possible that we might have just not given it a first name or not given it a last name, and it probably shouldn't go through these lines of code. But at the moment, it's still running this function, trying to get the title case from the empty string and then printing it. And I can prove this to you by just adding an extra word in here. So again, empty first name, empty last name, and then it prints result, and then of course nothing. How can we get it to bypass the rest of the code if the user typed in an empty first name or last name? Well, we could use what I mentioned before, an early return. So we could just write return without anything afterwards, and this is going to escape the function. So it's basically going to terminate the function early. Now, this time, if I leave an empty first name and last name, you'll see it prints none, because there is no output from this to print. Now, of course, it's probably safer to actually return something that tells the developer what's actually going on, so we can give a meaningful message like return something like this. So this way we can catch the cases when something is not quite right and then exit our function instead of wasting time for it to continue working on something that we don't want it to do. We've covered a number of things in today's lesson, and I want you to combine this with your existing knowledge to tackle the challenge in the next lesson, to get to grips with this concept of functions with inputs and with outputs. Head over to the Replit Day 10.1 Days in Month coding exercise. Here you'll notice that I've copied over the isLeapYear function that we created a while back in another coding exercise. Now, the first thing I want you to do is to modify this function so that instead of printing leap year or not leap year, we're actually just going to return true if it is a leap year and false if it's not a leap year. Because we're going to be using that function in the next function that you're going to modify, which is a function that's going to tell you how many days there are in the month that you specify. So for example, if I was to call days in month and passing in the year as 2022 and the month as 2, then I should get an output of 28, as in there's 28 days in February 2022. This is the reason why we need to know about leap years, because in a leap year, there's actually 29 days in February. You're going to combine the output from this function as well as this list of days in the month in order to modify this function to output the number of days in a month when this line of code is called. It's really important that you don't change any of the code below, but you are going to modify this function and add more lines of code in it. Take a look at the hints if you get stuck, but otherwise pause the video and give it a go. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change each of these print statements so that it returns a Boolean instead. So this one should return true and this one should return true. Now, when it's not a leap year, I'm going to return false instead. This way, basically, when we call this function isLeap passing in a year, then we'll get the output as either true or false. So we can now use that inside our function days_in_month. But before we do that, we need to get some inputs. We need to know what is the year and what is the month the user is interested in. So that is going to be passed in using these positional arguments. We're going to ask the user to input a year and input a month, and then each of these pieces of data gets passed into here and here, which will end up inside our function ready for use. The first thing I'm going to check is if the year is a leap year. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use our function here, isLeap, passing in that year, and then the output will be checked using the if statement. Remember that the way that if statements work is that if something is evaluated to true, then it's going to carry out the line of code below. But if it was evaluated and it turned out to be false, then it's going to skip this line of code. So instead of using true or false, or if 3 is bigger than 2, we're going to use the function isLeap and pass in the year that we got as an input. So this way, when a year is tested in this function, then it's going to output either true or false, which is going to replace this part of the code because it's the output from this function. So now if that output is true, namely it is a leap year, then we're going to check if the month they were interested in was the month of February. So if the isLeap year is true and the month is equal to 2, well, in that case, then we're going to return 29 because there's 29 days in February in a leap year. If this is the case, then this function is going to end right here when it returns 29. But if this is not the case, then it's going to bypass this line of code and we can output the number of days in a month for any other condition. So when it's not a leap year, we can go ahead and simply just use the return statement to tap into that list called month days. And we're going to pull out the value at the current month that's being requested. But remember that because lists start counting from 0 and the month that the user is going to be interested in doesn't start from 0. So if they're interested in January, then this month, instead of being 1, should actually be 0 to pull out this 31. So then we actually have to subtract 1 from it. So now if we test the code and we enter the year 2022 and the month of February, then we get the correct output, which is 28. That solves the challenge. Now, some of you I know might have gone even further, because we talked about using the return statement to catch out any situations where there might be invalid inputs. So you could, if you wanted to, also add an if statement that checks whether if the month is greater than 12 or if the month is less than 1. In these cases, then it's actually an invalid input, and you could just return invalid month. And you could of course do the same thing for the year, and this way it ensures that our function doesn't progress unless we have clean data. But this, of course, is not necessary to complete the challenge, because we're now able to figure out the days in the month using this leap year function's output and the output from our days in month function. In the next lesson, I'm going to address something that a lot of students are thinking at this point. And the question is, why return at all? Why not just simply print the outputs instead? Because this way it seems to end up doing the same thing, right? It's still going to print this down here. And if we just added a print to this return and a print here and got rid of this one, then it would still behave exactly the same. This is exactly what I want to talk about in the next lessons. So see you there.